Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I thought I'd do something a little bit different and do a review of my Pentax 6.7. I'm going on having this camera for about 5 years now, and I thought it'd be interesting to do a long-term review of the camera. I know it's kind of a popular thing for people to pick up cameras and kind of review them and get first impressions, but I think it's more rare to see people who have been using a camera for a very long time give a more thorough review of the things that they like and don't like about a camera over a long period of time. As for how I'm going to do this review, I'm going to try to not get too technical. I'm just going to kind of go over some of the features of the camera, some of the accessories, the things that I do and don't like about the camera, and just kind of things that you may want to know about the camera before you buy it. So there are four models of the Pentax 6.7. There's the Pentax 6x7, the Pentax 6x7 MLU, which is what this model is here. MLU just stands for mirror lockup. There's basically a switch on the side of the camera that when you put it up, it flips the mirror up, and that way when you take a photo, the only thing that's moving is the shutter curtain, and then the mirror comes back down, as opposed to the mirror slapping up and back down, which makes your camera shake, and depending on how sturdy your tripod is, stuff like that, you can get shake in your camera. The third model is the Pentax 6.7, which from what I know is mainly cosmetic changes, maybe some of the internals were updated. And then the fourth model is the Pentax 6.7 II, which I'm not going to go too much into because it's pretty different than these models, and I do want to kind of focus on the Pentax 6x7 MLU. So all of these cameras take 120 film or 220 film, which you can select on the right side of the camera, changing this selector switch to 120 or 220, and then also changing the back plate on the inside of the film door to 120 or 220. If you don't know what you have selected on the outside of the camera on the back, it will also say 120 or 220. To talk about the ergonomics briefly, it's kind of just like a giant SLR. It's similar to if like a Canon A1 or F1 was like 3 times its size. It's also a pretty heavy camera, I will say. I think that this might be a little overstated. I don't think it's as heavy as everyone always talks about it being. But over the years, I will say I do think that it is a relatively heavy camera. It's just not going to be as heavy as like an RB or RZ 6.7. I think those cameras are probably the biggest and bulkiest cameras that you can have. As for lens selection, there's a pretty massive catalog for the Pentax 6.7 system, and if there's a focal length that you like to use, it's probably available. As far as the standard focal lengths for the system go, I would say those would be the 90mm f2.8, which is kind of like a 45mm lens in the 35mm format. There's the 105mm f2.4 lens, which is what I have on this camera right now. If you've never seen images made with this lens, I would recommend looking up some of those. They render images in a way that I don't think other lenses available do, and it's certainly my favorite lens that I've ever shot with. Moving on, another popular lens would be the 75mm f4.5, and if you have the money, there is the f2.8 version of this lens, but it is ridiculously expensive. But if you do want kind of the best of the best 35mm equivalent lens, this would probably be the one that you would be going for. Other than that, there's quite a few different options for weird lenses. You got fisheye lenses, there's a leaf shutter lens, which really is the only lens in the system that will allow you to shoot at a flash sync speed faster than 1/30th of a second. There are also macro lenses and zoom lens options for this system. Really, any kind of lens that you're looking for is probably going to be available in some shape or form on the Pentax 6.7. The last thing that I'll touch on with lenses are the differences between the models of lenses for the camera. There are basically 2 for every single lens, and there's the early and late versions, the early ones being the Takumar versions. The Takumar versions have a radioactive element in them called thorium, which kind of turns the lens sort of orange. And this can be cleared up by exposing it to sunlight or any UV light. Personally, I've used both the Takumar versions and the SMC later versions, and I haven't really noticed any difference in the two, except you're probably going to be paying a bit more if you want the newer versions. Supposedly, there were updates to the late models' lens coating, and this helped with micro contrast and lens flares. But I don't know. In my experience, I honestly have noticed absolutely no change in my images. I think really one of the only reasons why you might want a later model is that there's less of a chance that there have been issues with it because it's just been around for less time, but in the end I think a well cared for lens is a well cared for lens. Lastly, before moving on to accessories, I'll briefly talk about the flash sync speed, which is 1/30th of a second, which really for any camera is pretty slow. But especially for a camera like this that has issues with camera shake, that's just kind of unacceptable for most people. So if you're someone that uses flash pretty frequently, you'll probably want to look into another system maybe, unless you want to use the leaf shutter lens for the system. Moving on to the accessories, and there's quite a few of them, and honestly, I love all of them. The main one that you've probably seen if you've looked into the system at all is the wooden grip. There's a lot of debate about the left-hand grip. A lot of people think that it's on the wrong side of the camera, but I tend to disagree. I kind of like it on the left-hand side. It gives you something to kind of hold on to, and your right hand can be dedicated to the shutter button. And then another thing that I think that you should pair with this camera is the focus ring. And it just makes it so that you can focus and hold the camera nicely all with your left hand, and your right hand can kind of just focus on pushing the button. I tend to like this system setup personally, but you know, everyone's different. Other common accessories that you can find on most other cameras too, you can get a lens hood for this camera, which I've actually been meaning to get for a while now. I do have lens flare issues from time to time. There are different finders for this system. You can get a waist level finder, you can get a chimney finder, there's a metered prism that you can use as well. I personally don't use that because I do prefer external metering for medium format, but you can get that if you want to. Something that I think is maybe a little overlooked on this camera are actually the strap lugs. I think there's a lot of options when it comes to the locations that you can put your strap lugs on the camera. You can put them on the top right and top left of the camera like you would a normal SLR and just hang it around your neck that way. But there's also on the bottom right and bottom left of the camera, there are more strap lug locations. So if you want to hang it differently or you know, mismatch those, you can do that. And then on top of that, on the left-hand grip, if you look on the back of that, there are actually two more locations because the left-hand grip actually takes up the lug locations on the left side of the camera. And that's actually the way that I prefer putting my strap lugs on my camera. To show you how I carry my Pentax, I have, again, the strap lugs on the back of the grip, and I sling it across my body sideways. And that way, when I bring it up to my eye, I don't have this strap kind of hanging over the viewfinder or hanging over my hands like you would if you had it on the lugs on the top. And so, I don't know, I think it just makes it easier to bring it up to your eye, take a photo, and sling it back to your side and continue walking. It's also not bouncing against your chest. It's just kind of like on your thigh. And that's just how I prefer carrying my Pentax. Lastly, the standard focusing screen on this system is a microprism focusing system. If you want a split image focusing system, it is available, but it's pretty uncommon. It's very expensive and you need a technician to install it for you. So just keep that in mind if you're someone who likes split prism focusing. Lastly, before I get into the main pros and cons part of the video, I want to go over things that you might want to look out for before you buy a Pentax. In general, as with all cameras, you probably want to see the last time that it was CLA'd. The last thing that you want to do is get a brand new camera that you then have to dump more money into and that you're not going to see for another couple months. One of the common issues is a spacing issue. A lot of people lose the last frame of their roll because the gaps between images is too large. Luckily, I've never had this issue before, but apparently this is very common in Pentaxes. Make sure to check the battery compartment that there's no corrosion or anything like that. I've seen people have issues with theirs where the mirror will get stuck up even using fresh batteries, which is usually the solution to that problem. So just make sure that that's working okay. If you want to use a metered prism with the auto exposure function on the lens, then I would recommend looking at the coupling chain, which is underneath the prism. Just make sure that when you take off the prism on this camera that you're taking off the lens first. There's a chain in between the prism and the lens that basically communicates the shutter speed and the aperture of the camera. If that chain is broken, then those can no longer communicate, and you will need a technician if you don't know how to do it yourself to put that back in place. Lastly, if you're in person, I would try to check and see if the shutter speeds are accurate. And it's a little weird on how to do that. Unless you have film in the camera, it actually by default will not have tension, and so you can't fire the shutter. So to trick your camera into doing that, you're going to open the film door just a little bit, And then on top where it shows what frame you're on, you're going to push down on that wheel and then push to the left. And when you twist that to the left and then shut the door and then let go on your thumb, it tricks your camera into thinking that it has tension, and then you can fire the shutter. And then you can just test on all the speeds and just kind of like either time it with your phone at 1 second and then just kind of, you know, divide that by 2 every single time in your head and see if they sound kind of accurate. That's how I would do it. So this brings us to the pros and cons that I have with this camera over the last 5 years or so. And we're going to start with the cons just so we can end on a good note. So starting with the cons, this is a pretty heavy camera. If you are planning on hiking with this camera, if you're planning on going on extensive trips and taking this everywhere, this might not be the most practical camera. I took this on an extensive trip to Yellowstone and the Badlands and the Black Hills, and I gotta be honest, it was pretty grueling. It's gonna produce amazing images for you, but just know that this is not really a hiking camera, I don't think. Number 2, the mirror slap of this camera is actually pretty substantial. If you're looking at shooting handheld at 1/30th of a second or below, I would recommend having a tripod, and I would recommend having the MLU option. And even with that, I have had problems with micro vibration, even on a tripod. It is what it is. I try to shoot at 1/60th or above for handheld, and that tends to work fine for me. But if you're wanting to shoot at slower speeds and even on a tripod, especially between like 1/15th and like half of a second, you still might have issues with micro vibrations even with the MLU option. This is something that I think is kind of overlooked and not talked about, but if you're someone who wears glasses, this is gonna fuck your shit up. The eyepiece is this jagged piece of hard plastic, and because it's kind of hard to see the full viewfinder, if you're a glasses wearer, you're constantly putting your glasses up against it pretty hard, and so that's just going to mess up your glasses. So I recommend, if you do have contacts, to wear contacts when you're shooting on the Pentax 6.7. Not that this is necessarily a con, because you're probably going to be doing this with any camera, but maintenance, I've had to send this thing in to get repaired I think 3 times in the past 4 or 5 years. So just know that this is a camera that probably constantly needs to be, worked on. But again, routine CLAs are, something that you should be doing with all your cameras. Something that might be a con for some people is that this is not a fully mechanical camera. It does require a battery to operate. Just keep a couple in your bag. They are 4LR44 6-volt batteries. I think they're like the same batteries that you put in like dog collars. So they're widely available. They're pretty cheap. They don't take up much space. Just keep a couple in your bag and you're fine. An issue I know some people have is that they will accidentally bump the MLU switch, and when the mirror goes up, you can't put it back down unless you take a photo. So that might be an issue for some people. For me personally, and I don't know if the tension is just stronger on my switch or something, but I don't think I've accidentally bumped it, and if I have, it's never been enough to flip it up. What I actually think is easier to bump is the auto aperture switch on the lens. All right, pause. Future Brockton here. After 5 years of owning this camera, this idiot somehow just now realized that the auto and manual switch on the lens relates to manually viewing the depth of field versus having the lens automatically stop down to the aperture that you have selected when you take a photo. I thought for the longest time that the viewfinder was too dark and that I had to focus at the largest aperture, then reapply my desired aperture, and then recompose, when all this time I could have just left the switch on auto. It's quite possibly the most embarrassing thing that I've learned about my workflow to date. But now let's move on to the pros of this camera, and boy, there are quite a few pros of this camera. It is still a extremely affordable camera. When I bought this camera, and I know this is a while ago, I think I got this thing for $600, $700 all in, like wood grip, body, the 105, it was the Takamar version, but doesn't matter. All of that, $600, $700, that's crazy. Nowadays, I think you can still get all of that, including the grip, for I think $1,000. You can find them on eBay still. That is a crazy deal considering some of the other options out there. If you want like a Mamiya 7 or a Mamiya 7 II, I mean, you're looking at spending like $4,000 for a lens and a body. It's crazy. Another pro for me is just the positive shooting experience in general. I think it looks and feels great. I think the ergonomics, especially when you're using things like the left-hand grip and the focus ring, are great. When you're using this camera, it really feels like you have something special and durable in your hands. I also think this camera is very easy and intuitive to load for a beginner who's getting into medium format. A lot of people will also complain about the loading experience of this camera. I've never had an issue with it. I think it's just like loading a 35mm SLR with different paper. I really don't think it's that complicated. Yeah, I think it's easy for a beginner, and I've never had any issues. And let's get the obvious one out of the way, the shutter sound on this thing. I mean, can you beat this? Lastly, and definitely most importantly, is just the image quality that you're going to get out of this camera. I've produced the best images I've ever taken on this camera, bar none. Something about the images with this camera, they're not too clinical, they're not too whimsical. Everything just kind of feels right when I'm using this camera. So yeah, you can nitpick about it being a little heavy, and sometimes it's hard to shoot handheld and it's not fully mechanical, but at the end of the day, your camera is there to take photos, and this one has very little competition in my opinion. If you're taking your time and being patient, as you should, this camera is more than capable of producing your best work, and I look forward to taking it out of my bag every single time. And not to do this cliche, but don't take my word for it, because cameras aren't 100% universal for everybody. What works for me is not going to necessarily work for you, and people really just need to find a system that works for them and their process. I want to thank everyone for watching. Let me know what you think about the Pentax 6.7. Do you love the camera? Do you hate the camera? And if you found the video helpful, consider giving the video a like or subscribe to the channel for more content. And I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and I forgot to mention I finally got my Leica M6 back from a CLA.